included 6 country studies, and Professor El-Badawi will be speaking to that. And the second part, and Luis Miguel and Ramiro will be talking to it, was a group of researchers around Red Sur. Red Sur is a network of economists. The secretariat is based in Uruguay, but a network of economists, a very unique network of economists across the Latin American region. Both these two groups all worked on the question of the growing debt crisis. And you may wonder, some people will wonder, you know, this is a conference on tax, and I thought it was really important to have a discussion on the growing debt crisis. And I think the main reason, what I've come to realize, people say, like, nobody wants to talk about taxation. There's one thing people want to talk even less about, and that's about repaying debt. So the reason these come together is that there must be the two least popular topics in the development studies. Of course, the main reason that I thought it was important to have this conversation is that we're looking at, this conference is looking at tax policies, revenue generation, with the climate the needed policy for the climate transition. Revenue generation is really, really important. Revenue generation across the world has been stagnating. The main topic of the reason that we have this conversation here is that those reforms need to take place in a context of growing debt. I think public debt in most countries is now stabilizing, but still most of the countries we're talking about are looking to reduce their debt, are looking to repay their debt, and the real question then is, how can you initiate those reforms in that particular context? Professor Al-Badawi will talk about this, actually provides certain opportunities, but and it's both the opportunities and the challenges that we're looking at. So there's one presentation by Dr. Ekeruche. We will then move to the 2 presentations from Latin America, and then the one from MENA. So the first one, and please come to the podium, is by Mma Ekeruche, who is a research fellow at the Center for Studies of African Economies, based in Nigeria. Almost right. You're correct. Thank you so much for being here. I should also say Ma has had the most difficulty even coming here, so I'm so happy that you're here.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Okay, great. So good afternoon everyone. Thank you so much GDN for organizing this very insightful conference. Thank you, Arjan, for the warm welcome. Today, we'll be looking through this paper, Debt for Climate and Development Swaps in Nigeria. It's one part of a 3-part project funded by the IDRC, and it's been carried out by researchers from the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, an economic think tank based out of Abuja, Nigeria, and also researchers from Brookings Institution, the Africa Growth Initiative. And so I'm presenting the paper on behalf of a 5-man research team. So very quickly, we'll go through the background of the paper, objectives. Then we'll assess the extent to which Nigeria is suffering from a debt crisis risks and the association with development priorities. After that, we will answer the question whether there is a need for a debt swap in the first place. Then we'll move to the viability of a debt swap in Nigeria using a scenario analysis. And then we'll respond to the question whether the amounts that we come up with based on the scenario analysis, whether they are realistically eligible for debt swaps. And then we would end with the impacts of a debt swap based on cases from other countries that have engaged in debt swap programs. So to set the stage, for the paper and provide a little bit of background on the climate and debt risks in Nigeria. The country is currently suffering from severe disruptions in climatic conditions. So rise in temperature, also rise in sea levels, flooding, extreme weather events. When we wrote the paper, the key example that we put forward was the shrinking of the Lake Chad. But more recently, we've had, a very severe climatic events with the flooding in Nigeria. Currently, 33 out of Nigeria's 36 states are underwater. It's led to 600 deaths, over 600 deaths in the last 2 months. And, this has all the more brought awareness to Nigeria's changing climatic conditions. To put numbers to the problem, estimates show that by 2050, we would have lost between 6 to 30% of our GDP, estimated to be about 100 to 460 billion dollars. Now, this is not only happening on the climate front, but also on, other development priorities: education, health, female empowerment. So in education, we have the largest number of out-of-school children. Health, very limited investments in health, scarcity of human, material, financial resources, and this shows in the health indicators. Women are more disproportionately affected by men on both the education and health fronts. Now, on the other hand, so for the debt situation, in the last 5 years, we've seen our debt level increase by astronomical proportions. So debt is currently estimated at $100 billion, which is a significant increase from only 5 years ago, when it was about $64 billion. So that's about a 56% increase, which is pretty significant. At the peak of the pandemic, we were spending almost 90% of the federal government revenue just to service debts. And so that left us with very little to respond to the economic and health impacts of the pandemic. And we also see that, or we also expect that the rise in debt will all the more increase going forward. Interest rates in advanced countries are increasing. We've fallen into a form of refinancing risks, where because we don't generate that much tax revenue, tax revenue only accounts for about 5% of GDP in Nigeria, the lowest globally. And so we all the more have to fall back on debts to meet our spending needs. I have a little quote over there that just shows the reason why policymakers and researchers are considering debt swaps to meet these climate and debt risks. So the paper has 3 main objectives. First is to demonstrate the need for a debt swap in the Nigerian context. We do that by showing how very little investments is being made in the key sectors. Also by showing how vulnerable we are to the changing global climatic conditions. And finally, by showing how debt crisis risks are increasing. The second objective is to show the viability of debt swaps. So basically, how much can we really get if we engage with our creditors in a debt swap program? We do that using a scenario analysis. We put forward 3 scenarios. The baseline scenario, so what if only ODA eligible Paris Club debts is swapped and worst performing Eurobonds? So what if private creditors engage? but then only worst performing Eurobonds are swapped. The second scenario is the optimistic scenario. So what if all Paris Club debts, including the worst performing Eurobonds and also including multilateral concessional loans, what if that is swapped? And then the third scenario, which we're hoping, is not the case, but the pessimistic scenario, what if only OD eligible Paris Club debt is swapped? And the third objective is we demonstrate the impacts of a debt swap on, or the potential impact rather, of a debt swap on climate-related finance. So it's one thing for you to engage in a debt swap program, but it does not necessarily translate into an increase in financing environmental finance. So we do that using the experience of 5 countries that have previously engaged in debt swaps, and we try to look at their environmental spending. So did it increase in years following the program? Now, to start off, we look at the debt crisis risks and its association with development priorities. So the graph on my top right, it points to how much the country is spending on key sectors. So education gets only 9% of the budget, health gets only 5%, which is between 2009 and 2019, which is significantly below what other countries are spending, and more importantly, it's significantly below what we have agreed to spend on these sectors based on agreements that we've signed in the past, regional and global agreements. Now it's even worse for female empowerment or gender-related sectors and the climate sector, where we're spending less than 1% of the entire budgets on these sectors individually. At the same time, the World Risk Index for Climate and Disaster Risk shows that we carry the 7th highest risk on the continent. So we're highly vulnerable to the changing climatic conditions, and also we lack coping mechanisms and adaptation capacity. Based on the foregoing, we have to raise significant finance in order for us to meet our NDC targets. For instance, as nationally determined contributions targets, we have to raise about 177 billion. And so basically, where is this money going to come from, right? And that's what's making researchers to put forward the debt swap arguments. As I mentioned earlier, debt has increased, but this is not the first time. Just to provide a bit of background, this is not the first time that we're being confronted with astronomical debt levels in the country. In 2004, 2005, we had to approach creditors for a debt restructuring or debt forgiveness scheme, the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative with Paris Club creditors. But whereas at that time, most of our debts was being owed to Paris Club creditors, currently most of our debts is being owed to multilateral creditors and private creditors that are less reluctant to engage in debt restructuring programs. So based on 5 criteria, we carry out this analysis, which will I say rank, but positions countries in the continents, countries that are highly climate vulnerable, countries that have high debt risks. The criteria, they're listed, but I don't want to waste too much time, on that. But I just want to show us where Nigeria ranks. So we are highly climate vulnerable, but we have a low debt risk, just because most of our debts is owed to domestic creditors rather than external creditors. However, because we are less likely to benefit from concessional finance, it's all the more means that in the future this may change, and so we'll have to rely on external creditors. And so the debt risk in the future would increase. Okay, so moving on to the second objective of the paper, the viability of debt for development swaps using the scenario analysis. So data is gotten from the Paris Club creditors and also from the World Bank International Debt Statistics. What we find is that based on the baseline scenario, which assumes that only OD eligible Paris Club debts and the worst performing Eurobonds are swapped, what we find is that we're only able to benefit from debt swaps in the amount of, or to the tune of $3.7 billion. For the optimistic scenario, which then includes multilateral concessional debts, if that is swapped as well, we are now able to benefit from, up to $11.8 billion. And then if the pessimistic scenario, which only assumes that OD eligible debts is swapped, we're only able to benefit $744 million. The graph shows how much we expect to get from private creditors, how much we expect to get from multilateral creditors. But basically, the summary there is that most of it would have to come from multilateral creditors, and then some of it from private creditors. But the chunk will have to come from multilateral creditors. Now, are these amounts, so basically, for instance, the 11.7 billion that we expect to get from the optimistic scenario, in reality, are these amounts eligible for debt swaps? So in a yes and no, that's probably the maximum we can get, but the chances that we'll get that amount is very limited for several reasons. First, some debtor countries are not very willing to engage creditors and basically request for debt restructuring or debt forgiveness for several reasons, chief of which is the fact that it creates a potential perception bias. So these creditors begin to view you as credit unworthy, and so in the long term, when you go back to ask for a loan, it's very possible that you'll be punished, get higher interest rates. And so because of that, some debtor countries are unwilling to engage with, specific creditors when it comes to requesting for debt restructuring, or in this case, debt swaps. We saw that in the HIPIC era, but also more recently, we've seen that with the debt service suspension initiative, where certain debtors that were technically eligible still did not participate in the program just because they wanted to avoid this potential perception bias. Secondly, each creditor has certain rules, so each creditor has rules that govern the maximum amounts that they're willing to swap. So that may also affect the amounts that we've seen in the previous slide. And then thirdly, there are debt conversion policies that govern creditors. So creditors, for instance, have conversion policies that states the specific countries that you're going to engage with, that also states the specific types of debts that are going to be swapped. And so when you put all these reasons together, it's very possible that we may not get up to the maximum amount that we're projecting to get. Now, the third objective, which is the last, what is the guarantee that after getting the benefits from the debt swap programs, what is the guarantee that this translates into an increase in environmental spending in Nigeria? So based on the experiences of 5 countries, Poland, Bulgaria, Jamaica, Indonesia, and Philippines, we find that in most cases, or in 2 countries actually, it actually, the reverse was the case. It actually translated to a decline in environmental spending. Only in Poland, Bulgaria, and Jamaica did it over time increase their spending towards climate-related objectives. And the reason is very simple. So there's the fungibility bias that is associated with these programs, where governments feel that, okay, since there's a new inflow coming in, we can now decrease the amounts that we originally intended to spend on these sectors. And so, you know, it creates actually a negative effect. Okay, so to conclude, we see debt swaps as part of the solution, not to the climate and debt concerns the country is currently undergoing. Chief of which, because the amounts that we're expecting in the most optimistic scenario that we're expecting to benefit only accounts for less than 10% of what is required to meet our NDC targets. And also because of the other caveats that I mentioned earlier. However, if the fungibility bias is avoided, it's very possible that debt swaps can provide very meaningful assistance in funding climate-related projects, and also can reduce the debt burden. So for these reasons, the paper recommends that debt swaps are a viable way to achieve, to, you know, provide, to fund needed projects, and also to expand budgetary resources to alleviate the debt burdens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ma. I think this is such an important example. It's like, yes, Nigeria might not be the most debt vulnerable country, but the numbers really matter. You see how much the repayment of debt is already, you know, well beyond the repayment of debt, already well beyond the spending in social sectors. And then never mind the commitments made for the NDCs. This highlights very nicely, I think, both the kind of dire straits that the country and the specific solutions. Of course, there's I think you say it's like there's no magic bullet there either. It can work. It can import a contribution under specific conditions. As we're setting up for, I think Ramiro, you're going to go next, right? But perhaps if there's any very quick questions to Ma, I think we can take those now. Some of them we may keep till the. Does anybody wanted to quickly respond to any of this? There's one. Shall I run?
It's okay. It's my job. Thank you. I think it's an excellent presentation. I just the way it is presented, it looks like debt restructuring, debt swap. Is basically the reason I'm saying is okay. Let me introduce myself. I'm Niranjan Sarangi at United Nations ESQA, the Arab Regional Commission. We have an initiative on debt swap for climate finance, and that looks at operationalizing the mechanism. So many of the aspects presented are there, but the way it is presented here, it looks like a debt restructuring. And the moment you give that perception, it creates a huge bias against the concept of swap. The certain things to look at in this context is that the nice thing you also that the one which you presented as the pessimistic scenario, perhaps that's the most optimistic scenario. I mean, if it works out well. So details of this I would like to share with you, the initiative and how it is operationalized, and we have Jordan and creditors A lot of lessons learned over the last 3 years. To be careful is to look at how you connect it to climate and what are the objectives. It's not that the examples that you gave on Indonesia and other countries, it's because those are swaps which are done on ad hoc basis, not like a planned swap where the result can be attributable to particular achievements. That is one of the criticism of the previous debt swaps. The new thinking on this debt swap is started with the financing for development beyond COVID-19, the initiative led by Canada and Jamaica. And that's where the debt for climate swaps came up as the new generation debt swaps. So I think on this literature, perhaps you can update it, update the paper. Thank you.
Let's keep that, great points. I'm sure you agree, Ma. Let's keep that to the discussion then, right? I think in the interest of the time, if there's no immediate reactions, he'll at the end. At the end. Okay. Thank you, merci. Let's turn to the screen. Ramiro, are you there? Are you going to go first, Ramiro, or
yes.
Miguel? Okay, so here's
yes.
Ramiro. Quickly introduce yourself. We've introduced you as the one of the lead researchers in the Red Sewer framework. But go ahead. Thank you so much in joining from, I think, the south of the continent. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, thanks Arjan, and thanks everyone there. I'm Ramiro Albrieu. I'm a principal researcher at Red Sur, at CPEC, also associate researcher within the Commitment to Equity Institute. And I was listening to Ma, and I think that we can react with our own project on debt and sustainability that is more focused on the Latin American outlook, that is kind of different, but also kind of the same than in Africa and in other parts of the global south. You know, in a way, in Latin America, I think that we have learned the hard way about not to enter into some turbulence, some risky markets for public debt. Remember the early 80s, the late 90s, and I think that now we are in a different situation regarding debt management, debt structure, and so on. But we are all, in a way, all the countries in the global south are all entering into this phase of the need for fiscal consolidation, and thinking alternative path for fiscal consolidation, tax reform, expenditure reform, and so on. So in that sense, I think that we are pretty much looking at the same agenda in the near term, of how to think about fiscal consolidation strategies, how to think about rethinking the debt management structure, and so on. I was against. I'm trying to start a revolution against PowerPoint, but I think that I will have to share because we are all sharing PowerPoints. But let me just finish my introduction without PowerPoint, and then I will move to the most common PowerPoint. So in our project, but one of the things that we are trying to do, thinking about these challenges in the near future, is to integrate the different aspects of sustainability. As we all know, when we are studying debt dynamics, we always focus on we can call the financial sustainability, or how to create fiscal space in the short run, to please creditors or for many reasons. But in a way, when we think about debt sustainability analysis, we always think about, reducing fiscal deficits in a way, no matter what. So, and in our project, we are trying to reframe the fiscal sustainability frameworks to add other dimensions of sustainability. One of these dimensions has to do with social sustainability. Of course, for example, I don't know, I think that Nora Lustig was in this conference, but the institute that she's running, they are working with, you know, IMF and other multilaterals in assessing the distributive impacts of alternative paths for fiscal consolidation. In a way, that's a way of integrating, you know, financial sustainability, we can say, with social sustainability. I think that that's a very promising avenue. But in our project, what we are trying to do is try to find a framework for integrating environmental sustainability into traditional debt sustainability analysis. So what we are doing, and now I'm going to share the PowerPoint because I know that I fail in my revolution, is again trying to connect debt management, fiscal policy, and sustainable development. And the plan, as I just mentioned, is to revisit the concept of sustainability, to add other dimensions. Particularly, in this case, I will show you our progress regarding climate, you know, climate transition and also climate shocks, you know. And what we are doing is to, yeah.
Ramiro, 1 second. I just want to check whether people can read the slide or we should expand it. Is it okay? That's better. Thank you.
That was not part of my plan against PowerPoints. Sorry, but no. Okay, now if you can see the slide. So the plan is to integrate traditional financial sustainability analysis with our analysis on climate and climate transition and climate shocks. And the idea is to find a common framework, but also to work with some application from Latin America. So we are working with different country teams in Honduras, in Paraguay, in Bolivia, and trying to check how these ideas are working in the field, and then how these case studies can feed our frame, right? So what we are doing is to first to have an outlook of the finances and instruments, tax instruments, expenditure instruments in our countries. Then, and this is something that we are working really hard on, finding the transmission channels that are connecting climate with the fiscal position, we can say, taxes and expenditures. I will talk about that later. Then we are trying to detect the fiscal risks associated to climate change in a way, making some diagnosis. And then we are moving to a proposal for financial instruments, you know, regarding debt management, and then more operational fiscal rules and procedures for integrating the different aspects of sustainability. So just let me give you, because it's too broad, but just let me give you a summary, for example, of the part that we are working on regarding the transmission channels from climate and natural resources to fiscal policy. We are thinking about two types of shocks. One regarding climate shocks, and the second regarding the climate transition. You know, on the one hand, we have precipitation, hurricanes, and so on. And the second, we are policies and new behavior in the private sector for greening the economy. You know, so we are working with these two different channels. Regarding the first channel of climate shocks, we are trying to detect, we are doing some econometric analysis to try to detect the indirect impacts on tax revenues through GDP. As you know, for example, in Honduras, Honduras is one of the countries that is really exposed to a lot of climate shocks. So there's a huge impact in GDP, so tax revenues are also being impacted. But also there's a huge impact in the expenditure side, you know, because of emergency expenditure, but also because of infrastructure, health, and other types of expenses. So we are trying to detect these channels in specific case studies. regarding the climate transition, again, we have an impact, of course, in public revenues, particularly here, for example, in countries such as Bolivia, who is really, the government is really reliant on rents from non-renewable natural resources. So there, we have like a trade-off between financial sustainability and climate sustainability. Because in a way, if you want to increase, the rents on stranded assets in Bolivia, you will go against climate transition. So we are trying to detect these trade-offs, and we are also analyzing the direct impacts on public expenditure as well. Many of our countries in Latin America has huge subsidies on energy and fuel consumption. For example, Argentina and Bolivia as well, and many other countries. So there we're thinking about how to create a path for reducing these subsidies and so on. So let me just finish this methodological part, just as showing some of our main first lessons. The first one is that what we are seeing now is that the current fiscal stance, I mean, the structure of taxes and expenditures are not aligned with the goals of climate transition and also with managing climate shocks. So even now, I mean, in the current situation, we are not doing the right thing regarding, how fiscal policy can help the climate transition. But think about the near future where we will have a lot of constraints. So it will be, again, even harder for our countries to think about environmental sustainability when we will have a lot of constraint on the financial side. That's why, and I will finish with that's we are working on trying to bring this common framework for integrating all these issues together, and then trying to bring in this to the international arena. That's why we are working with all these team within the T20, trying to bring some discussions there on other dimensions of sustainability beyond financial sustainability, and we are bringing these examples and other examples from other parts of the world, just to, raise the voice of trying to be aware of these other aspects of sustainability. Again, thinking about this near future where we will have a lot of pressure to reduce fiscal deficits and to consolidate the fiscal accounts. Well, I think that I will stop here, and maybe Luis Miguel, you can go to more specific information on the climate and so on.
Thank you very much. Can you put it down, the presentation? Sorry. Thank you. Well, I'm going to follow what he was talking. Ramiro was talking. I don't know if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can. It is going in
Yeah?
present. Yeah. Great. Thanks. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go a bit fast. I'm just going to put a few data on that, and I'm going to convince you of this following 5 points. No? First, I think it's an obvious part that it's COVID situation. After COVID situation, we have a fiscal and a public debt problem in Latin America, at least for the things we need to do. No? However, public debt in Latin America is under still management conditions. However, the fiscal space for any economic recovery is very limited, and therefore, to act on climate change is very difficult to do it if we don't move if we don't make significant structural changes in the next few years. Third one is these conditions are intensified because of the climate change challenge, because as Ramiro had already said, the fiscal impacts and as well the transition risk that we are followed to get a carbon neutral economy in 2050. And therefore, we need to make urgent and large structural transformation, including a green fiscal policy in the region, so we can support and open more space to make these changes. Also considering some changes in the way we manage the public debt as swaps and other thematic bonds, and I'm going to talk later on that. No, but for us, these public debt solutions, considering the magnitude of the changes we will have with climate change in the next few years, requires a structural transformation of the whole development strategy. Otherwise, if we try to solve the problem under the business as usual scenario, it won't help, because we will have again in 10 years or 20 years the same problem, but a bit increasing, because the climate change will intensify their impacts. This is just to go very fast. This is the rate of growth of all Latin America. It shows, of course, the COVID fall and the recovery, the post-recovery that we are having now in the region. And when we see the numbers of the fiscal deficit and the public debt, of course, they have increased in the last years, because trying to, the reduction on the fiscal revenue and the increase in expenditure that we have in these few years. However, it's still under management conditions. This is not completely under control, but it doesn't give another fiscal space to do the transition. That is, we are trying to use in Latin America some sort of fiscal policies to incentive the recovery. However, these policies, if we use all the money we have for that and we don't put it together with the climate change transition, it will be useless, and there is no moment to do the climate change transition. So we need to make the idea that if we want to make possible the climate change transition, we need to put together the recovery and the climate change transition expenditures. And just to show you a general point, these are the climate change costs for the global economy. Before, there were a lot of the studies that were concentrated between 0 and minus 5% of the GDP. However, in recent years, there is a new brand, a new type of studies that show that the climate change has significant impacts. Borke in 2015 put in a scenario that it goes to 23% of the GDP at the end of this century, depending on the scenario that we put. In this case, when we see it like that, it's a development issue, the climate change impact. So it's not only that it's going to have a small impact in a few areas and that's it, but it will impact the whole economy and the whole possibilities to grow in the next few years. When we see Latin America and the main emissions factors, we see basically that we have, of course, energy, as in a lot of places, but also we have land use change, which is basically deforestation, and agricultural emissions. We can all agree that deforestation we should stop for ethical reasons and economic reasons, and that's it. However, to make the changes to stop emissions in the part of energy and in the part in the agricultural sector is very difficult. Basically, energy is very, very strong, has a strong relation with the GDP evolution. And of course, the agricultural sector has a very strong implications for food and food security in the regions. And there is a problem with this, because when we see the Paris agreement, climate change agreement, it says that we are trying to make the target is 1.5 to 2 degrees in this century. And to make that possible, it's necessary, we require to be carbon neutral economies between 2050 and 2070. So these emissions that they are growing, they need to decouple completely from the GDP evolution and go down in the next 30 years. The magnitude of that change in Latin America is not possible if we don't have fiscal stimulus to move in that direction and support the structural change in the next few years. To show that very briefly, these are the consumption patterns in Latin America as taken from the surveys in the region. Of course, food is a very important thing, but of course, as well, transport is not a minor part, and of course, electricity and other factors. But when we see this by groups of different types of groups or income groups, we see, as we know, that if we divide the population by 5 groups, and the poor is in the left hand, which is the number 1, we see that we spend less and less in food. No, I mean, the richer you get, you spend less on that part. However, when we see what are increasing, we see immediately that the fuel expenditure in transport is increasing, which is basically private cars. And it's, of course, basically the use of oil. This idea is impossible to be, this is not consistent with the idea that we should arrive to a carbon neutral economy. That is, if we keep on having the same business as usual patterns of consumption in Latin America in the next 30 years, it will be impossible to arrive to the carbon neutral economy in 2050. And if you see that, it's happened as well, this pattern in other things, in health and education, which means that basically in Latin America, we are moving from public transport to private transport, public health to private health, and public education to private education, meaning that people are not happy with the public services that they receive. If we want to make a transition to a just climate transition, which includes all the population, we need to relaunch the public services that we have. We need to have universal and quality services in these areas so we can construct a low carbon economy in the next few years. And when we see the scenarios for Latin America, these are several scenarios, we see that the amount of energy efficiency and decarbonization of the economy that we need to make to arrive to the 2050 completely in a carbon neutral economy are significant. I mean, I just put here down some orderly and disorderly scenarios. One is that we do everything now until 2050. The other one, the disorder, is that we don't do anything until 2030 and we do everything at that moment. And basically you get rates of energy efficiency that we haven't seen in the region in the past. And they go really fast, even before, I mean, above 5%, 5 and 8%. So it will make very, very difficult for Latin America if we don't begin now to do the transition, to make possible the transition to a carbon neutral economy if we begin after 2030. It will be even, it's not very credible, and it's very costly that will happen. And when you see the green tax situation in Latin America, we are below as an average of what they are using in OECD countries. So there is some fiscal space to increase the green taxes in the region to try to support this transition. These green taxes will help in three senses, or could help in three senses. First, they will try to solve the negative externality, which is the emissions in the case of climate change, but as well in other parts like local atmospheric pollution and water pollution and all these things. Second one, it will increase the revenue, the fiscal revenue for the government, that it will be very important to make the transition. And the third one, there is, if you do it properly and you reorganize how you do it, effects, you might have probably a double dividend effect, which means that you may have some positive effects in the income distribution in Latin America. So I'm just going to show you these numbers and I finish with that. This is the case of Mexico. If we see the numbers in some areas, for example, we see basically that people in Mexico spend about 20% of their expenditure in transport, 5% in energy, 1% in water. If we consider that we can make that in a renewable and a sustainable way, and we see that the prices of these things, they are going down in the next few years, it probably will give the people an advantage in their income, I mean, in the income restrictions they have now. And for example, if we put all together and we see that it's 25% at least what they are spending in energy and transport, and we make it sustainable and going down the prices, then probably you will have at least 10% of their expenditure free to do it other things and support their education, health, and all other parts. So we think that there is a potential political, economic, and social coalition to move forward to the climate transition, in a sense that we can make a just transition using the green fiscal instruments and relaunching the public matrix so we can construct a low carbon economy in Latin America in the next 30 years. However, these changes are urgent and implies a significant structural changes. And the situation, the actual situation in the fiscal situation and in the public debt is not consistent with these changes. We need to move forward to get much more fiscal resources to do that, but as well to have new instruments that we can use to support this change. No? One is, of course, swaps, but as well, we were thinking in Latin America in all this, what they call it thematic bonds, which are sustainable bonds, green bonds, gender bonds, and all these options to make possible this change. And in some regions like Honduras, what they are calling contingency bonds, so we can have more compensated if something happened in the place and it's not possible because of the high vulnerability of the region that they cannot repay all these new potential options of financing the debt and the fiscal deficit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ramiro. Luis, we're going to keep questions still. I think there's a very good segue to the next presentation. Thank you so much for this. For the audience, there will be the regional study, the country case studies on Honduras, Paraguay, and
Bolivia.
Bolivia. Thank you, Ramiro. Will come out in a few months, and it's great to have the initial insight into that, and this key message, like even if debt management is relatively under control, it's still not up to the mark for the investment needs that are there, and I think the work in MENA is telling us very similar stories. So I turn it over double now. I give the mic here to Shireen, and I give the floor to Professor Al-Badawi out of Egypt.
Thank you, Arjan. This was really interesting presentations, and thank you for the opportunity to introduce Dr. Ibrahim El-Badawi. Dr. El-Badawi is the Managing Director of the Economic Research Forum, and for those of you who have not had a chance to know about the ERF, you're not meant to see that. That's too much insider information. There, yes. You'd be invited actually to check out our website. ERF is the leading regional network in the Middle East and North Africa. All our information about our distinguished affiliates, best part of 400 across the region, are detailed on the website. We're running a number of programs across different thematic areas: climate change, conflict, fragility, growth, employment, jobs and growth are all out there. We convene an annual conference that brings together best part of 300 people, and over the year we typically host events that host more than 3,000 people. And we also have our data portal that you'd be invited to check out, and as well the policy forum. Dr. Ibrahim Badawi is the Managing Director for the Economic Research Forum, and he is also former Minister of Finance and Economic Development of Sudan, 2019-2020. So he's best positioned to talk to us about taxation during debt crisis. And with that, I give you the floor, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Shireen. I hope everybody hears me well.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, let me first really extend our thanks and appreciation to Arjan and his IDRC colleagues for organizing this very interesting cross-continental kind of panel. And I'm really thrilled, really, and satisfied to see that actually there is a meeting of minds, so to speak, from all of the three presentations. Basically, we saw that actually the same messages, kind of pervade the experiences, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the context of Nigeria and Latin America, as well as in our case, drawing from the Commission, Growth Stabilization and Growth Commission report that we actually launched or presented at the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. So the messages are really very similar. And I think and it's interesting that all of these projects are funded by the IDRC. So this is really a great opportunity, really, to cross-fertilize and compare experiences around these messages. So let me start very quickly by saying, by presenting the key messages, that in the short run, expenditure need to be restructured, but austerity without growth is not an answer. And I think this is a message that Ramiro made it very clear in his presentation. Nonetheless, growth and social protection requires some hard fiscal choices in terms of restructuring the fiscal, stance and what have you, and as well as significantly, enhancing the fiscal effort. Essentially, there is a need for a new development model, and this new development model has to go beyond the technical macro economic sustainability, fiscal sustainability, and to embrace a broader concept of sustainability, which is another important message actually coming from all of these presentation. In our case also, we argue that there is a need for regional financial arrangement in terms of bridging finance. For Africa, for example, ARF and the Finance for Development Lab, the Paris School of Economics-based Finance for Development Lab, we came up with a proposal for the Africa Liquidity and Stability Mechanism, basically complementary to the global role that the IMF, for example, has been taking, or the discussion in the context of the IMF through SDRs and so on, is actually to help countries under stress to respond to the shocks, at least in the short to medium run, before fiscal policy could actually be significantly improved. But I would like to say also that, after all, I didn't put this here, but I will say it, that if charity did not start or could not be started at home, it has to end at it. So after all, sustainability and resilience require growing out of fiscal fragility. For our case in the MENA region, fiscal fragility is really a very glaring kind of failure, development failure at the macroeconomic and development level. So these are the key messages, and let me just go to providing some evidence, and you can see that actually we have the evolution of debt and the limited or the slowdown in growth and the decline in total investment. And we take this, we're talking about MENA, but we zero on 6 countries from the region. And we think, these are countries that are oil importing countries, and they represent a very interesting blend. Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan are countries which are, fairly stable in terms of the political order, even though they face some very serious challenges, economic and otherwise. Countries on the other extreme, Lebanon and Sudan, are countries that are facing some very dire, actually, challenges where the political order is being challenged, and the legitimacy of the political regimes are being challenged by the population in terms of protest and what have you. And Tunisia is in between. So this represents, because we do emphasize in the report that actually, after that economic reform is essentially a political choice by both the elites and the public, and it is very important to emphasize this. So the situation is very clear, as you can see from the debt, stock of debt to GDP ratios, quite significant. All of them are, above 80%. And cases like Sudan and Lebanon is actually quite extreme. While at the same time, we could see that the comparison of the first 2 decades of the 2020, the 2000 to 2010 to 2011 to 2019, you could see precipitous decline on average growth for all of the 6 countries, as well as in terms of significant decline in investment. So this situation exposed the region to the shocks, COVID-19, and of course, the war on Ukraine. According to the kind of simulation by the IMF and also by the Finance for Development Lab, it shows that only Morocco perhaps might be able to escape debt sustainability crisis, both for an IMF scenario baseline or historical trend, or in terms of accounting for shocks. But every other country, is open to serious debt situation problems. The fiscal policy or the fiscal stance is at the heart of this. You could see actually, from the table on the right, for the 6 countries, that large fiscal savings to stabilize the debt would require enormous political capital, because the structure of the fiscal stance in terms of revenues and in terms of allocation expenditure is loaded with political consideration. And so there is a very important challenge here facing authorities. Most public expenditure now go to wages, subsidies, SOEs, support, and interest payment on debt, all of which benefit powerful political constituencies. An iron fist approach, obviously, for cutting investment and social spending was a standard practice during the 1980s. However, in the context of the high social mobilization associated with the Arab Spring, the social and political impact of austerity can be expected to lead to even more risks of instability and social strife. So the story is mirrored also in several sub-Saharan Africa, we could add. So debt relief in the short to medium runs and a stronger revenue mobilization in the medium to longer runs are really the imperatives of the reforms for these countries. Let me very quickly say something about social protection. As we can see, if you look at the Arab group here, we will see that social protection deficit in low and middle income regions has a lot to do with low expenditure on the social sector. And so the growth strategy needs to be reorienting some expenditure towards new priorities in an environment with tight budget constraints. And these new priorities must be, public investment needs to rise, social spending on health and education also need to rise, and the poor need to be protected given the elevated prices of food and fuel. So destabilizing expenditure will be required, and restructuring it, while politically challenging requires mobilizing constituency that tend to benefit from a new pro-poor and pro-growth renewal agenda. For example, cash transfer can be a very effective instrument for mobilizing these constituencies. I will skip this, but these are all evidence that shows, the region, the Arab states, especially when you have the red color, they are well below the benchmark of the, the 2/3 rating across various developing regions. And you can see that, for example, for the case of disability and social protection associated with children, these are all areas where the Arab region ranks very poorly. And even the yellow ones are basically just around the average compared to the other developing regions. Okay, let me just go straight here to look at the challenges ahead in terms of that the growth strategy, we argue, is inextricably linked to the social agenda, just like my colleague says, particularly in the context of the Digitech, anticipated Digitech economic order. For example, Robert Lawrence has shown this very interesting figure that actually manufacturing will continue to be a growth accelerator, and the same also Danny Roderick, kind of emphasized this. However, the manufacturing will no longer provide the base for large-scale labor absorption. So this is a very serious challenge that will be faced by our countries, including in the Middle East, and that actually the historical Asian development model could not be replicated. Only highly skilled labor will benefit from this, as the dummy for high skilled labor compared to the green curve for the unskilled labor. So modern agriculture and tradable services would generate high productivity, but not as much labor absorption. So there is a looming social crisis. So unskilled labor in Africa and MENA countries might be trapped in low productivity services and low productivity agriculture, or continue to languish, especially in MENA, but I think also in Africa, in the informal sector. So this, I think, reinforces the view that the growth agenda must be integrated into the social agenda for sustainability. IMF programs that work out are necessary but not sufficient. This is one of the main conclusions of our report. Bridging the finance gap requires complementary regional financial arrangements, and this is the FDL steering committee report, the case for an African liquidity and stability mechanism. And also for the Arab countries, even though there is such a mechanism, it needs to be significantly enhanced to respond to the current challenges in terms of liquidity, addressing countries that are in need of liquidity, but not necessarily they are yet in a situation of insolvency. However, after all, as I said, viable national renewal agenda requires strong fiscal accounts. If charity could not start at home, it must end at it. And as we can see from this figure, that the revenues as a share of GDP are very low, even before the pandemic. And so there is fiscal fragility in terms of the fiscal effort, just the sheer fiscal effort. But more than that, actually, tax revenue is dominated by regressive taxation on trade, goods and services, indirect taxation in all of these, countries in question. And however, obviously, improving economic management and economic governance, as well as political governance, is very important as a requirement for improving, for kind of extricating countries out of fiscal fragility, such as voice and accountability, it's very clear it has an impact on the capacity of countries to improve, to get cooperation from the public, and also to improve the legitimacy of the state in its effort to expand the fiscal base and to increase the fiscal effort. It might, however, take a long time. This figure is the history of the British government, the United Kingdom government, in terms of, but obviously we can leapfrog now that in the age of technology. This shows that actually it took very long time for the British government to significantly increase the fiscal effort. But that's not necessarily applicable now, given that we can leapfrog. So digitally enabled cash transfers program have been influential in redistributing income to the poor and reducing poverty, increasing school participation, reducing child labor, improving utilization of health and nutrition services among mothers and children. Cash transfer program are also likely to enhance accountability, transparency, and trust, as I think we will hear from Shanta, has been writing quite convincingly and authoritatively on this important topic. And finally, I would just like to say something about Sudan very briefly. As a former minister of finance and national planning, I was really very proud that we were able to introduce the cash transfer, and we got significant support from the international community. And the idea basically is centered around a national narrative, economic narrative, that instill hope that we can actually move from the situation of conflicts and bad governance by directly empowering the population and graduating from subsidizing commodities to directly empowering the Sudanese people. And it was really a very powerful narrative. Unfortunately, it was disrupted by a coup, but there is considerable pressure now, and hopefully Sudan will reestablish its course back to democratic transition. But this program, I think, is very interesting, and it shows that actually cash transfers can be an important instrument for actually galvanizing the community that are likely to be the most beneficiary of these cash transfers, and mostly the poor. But then also, for enhancing the capacity of the state to collect data and build digital platforms, including to enhance the capacity of the revenue bureaus and customs institutions in our countries. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. And shall we just go straight to Dr. Shanta and then take questions? Okay. Dr. Shanta Devarajan is professor of the practice of international development, Edmund A. Welch School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University, with more than 28 years of experience with the World Bank, and previously to that with Harvard University. The floor is yours, Shanta. Whichever you want. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for this opportunity. I agree. This, for me personally, as some of you may know, I've been quite absorbed in trying to help Sri Lanka get out of its debt crisis this whole year. And it's been very difficult. It's probably the most serious debt crisis that any country is facing at this time. So it's kind of therapeutic to listen to other countries' debt problems for a change. And in many ways, it resonates, what was said today resonates with our thinking on Sri Lanka. And the basic message, and I agree that there's a recurrent theme through all of these papers, is that you don't treat debt crises as an isolated problem of their own and say, let's get over this debt crisis and then worry about growth. You just cannot do that. You never could do that, but if you thought you could do that in the past, you can't do that now. And I think all the Nigeria papers, the Latin America paper, and the MENA papers, for different reasons, did talk about how to integrate the debt crisis, or getting out of the debt crisis, the debt restructuring, out, get the debt restructuring as part of a program of resuming economic growth for reasons of social stability or environmental sustainability. They're both critically important in the long run. But I should say that having said that, and that recurring theme, I think we can learn a lot from the differences across these papers as well, because they do take slightly different perspectives. And so let me start with the Nigeria paper, because, and it's something of the wording. I think Niranjan was alluding to this. You kept talking about debt swaps, but this is really debt restructuring. The description was a debt restructuring, which is similar to what Ibrahim and the Latin Americans were talking about. You need to get Nigeria's debt to a point where the debt service payments is lower than what it is today. That's what a debt restructuring is. Now, I know people are sensitive to these words. I know the Chinese don't like to use debt restructuring as a word, but debt swaps really mean something very different. And it goes back to the debt for nature swaps and things like that, which is not what you're talking about here. Now that said, I think it's still important, and the Nigeria paper nicely illustrates this, that if we are going to do a debt restructuring, let's do it in such a way that there's some improvement in the environment, in our environmental protection of some form or the other. It's interesting that in the Latin American case, I think it was Ramiro who alluded to the other side of the equation, which is just as important, which is mitigation or the decarbonization. And I think he talked about Bolivia being a country that would be susceptible to decarbonization. And you know, I know this is a controversial issue, which is that some countries, mainly in Africa, have taken the position they shouldn't have to do mitigation because they didn't cause the problem, and so on. And you know, that's all correct. But the fact is, Nigeria is a major oil producer. If there is a global carbon tax, Nigeria is going to be stranded with hundreds of millions of barrels of oil that are now worth a lot less. Whether you wanted to or not, you're going to have to decarbonize. So this is something that's going to come. This is like another climate shock, except it's man-made. It's a carbon tax. So that could be the biggest climate disaster to hit Nigeria, let alone and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and there and few of Ibrahim's countries in the MENA region, my former countries, I would say, that are going to get there. So when we talk about the environmental sustainability, you are right to emphasize adaptation, all the floods and the droughts and the sea level rise and how much more spending needs to be done on that. But keep on the other side, you have to prepare, in terms of environmental sustainability, prepare for the time when hydrocarbons are obsolete. And that means for countries like Nigeria and Saudi Arabia, that's a huge adjustment. And that's a bigger shock maybe than some of these other shocks we've faced. Now, coming to adaptation though, this is one thing, I would qualify what you showed there about the increase in environmental spending. Because the whole point of adaptation, certainly my reading of adaptation, is that most of it has to do with good old-fashioned development practices. It's not like you have to spend something extra on adaptation. If you look at what countries need to do, the most important thing they need to do is invest in the maintenance of infrastructure. See, if you spend a little bit on the maintenance of the roads and the bridges and the electricity networks, just maintenance, not new, don't build any new or different networks. It turns out that that can withstand 90% of the climate shocks. And in fact, there's a very nice book written by some former colleagues of mine at the World Bank called Lifelines, where they've done these sort of Monte Carlo simulations to show what happens under different climate scenarios. They run 10,000 simulations. And they showed that 80% of these investments will pay for themselves. Except for the extreme shocks, most of these investments will be actually self-financing. And that's because that's good development practice. We've been telling countries for years, you got to spend more on maintenance than you do on new investments. Of course, for political reasons, politicians like to cut ribbons and open up new bridges and things like that. But it's actually sort of just an anecdote. in India, there was this 150-year-old bridge, right, in Gujarat, that the British built. Yeah, and they just renovated it, and a week later the bridge collapsed. Right, so that's what neglect. That's what the neglect of infrastructure maintenance means. Right. So let's keep that message in mind. And that's good development. You don't need to spend extra. It doesn't come under environmental spending. That is just plain old, good old-fashioned infrastructure maintenance. That's what governments should be doing. Another example would be irrigation. You know, again, that wouldn't come under your environmental spending, but irrigation is one of the best ways to adapt to climate change, because it's the increased variability of rainfall that's the biggest shock that countries are facing. But with irrigation, you can smooth out that variability, and that way you have more access to adaptation. Now, then, you see, unfortunately, or fortunately, I was involved in the last debt crisis in Nigeria, which was the HIPC, the MDRI, as you mentioned. And the thing there that I want to, you know, it's almost a sense of deja vu, because we had almost this exact same discussion 20 years ago, right? Kept saying, oh, we're underspending on education, underspending on health, because of this debt crisis. So the question I ask is, so Nigeria got debt relief, major debt relief, on grounds that they would actually increase spending on education, increase spending on health, and now you tell me they haven't done that. So why do we think it's going to happen now? This is the problem, and this is what Ibrahim was alluding to at the end. It's this lack of trust between government and its citizens that is undermining that economy. So if that's the case, how do we trust this government or any subsequent government to actually use the money wisely? And just to give you one anecdote, if you like, so some colleagues of mine have done this analysis for oil-rich countries in Africa, of which Nigeria is one, and asked the questions, a very simple question, which is, you take the oil money they get every year, and if you take a percentage of that and hand it out as cash transfers universally to the whole population of that country, how much of that, what percent of that oil money is needed to eliminate poverty? Literally, the poverty rate goes to 0. Right? Now, in some of the low population countries, that number is shockingly small. I mean, it's like 5%. But for Nigeria, it's 25%. So think about that. Nigeria gets about $30 billion a year in oil revenues. You take a quarter of that, $7.5 billion, and just hand it out to every single Nigerian, the same amount, and poverty disappears. Right? So that's the power of these cash transfers, and just to conclude, that's what comes back to, and by the way, those kinds of cash transfers can really build trust. Because I've been many times to Nigeria, to Lagos and Abuja and all over the place. And I talk to ordinary Nigerians and I say, I was trying to ask, why do you guys support fuel subsidies when you don't benefit from them? And they say, we don't trust the government. We don't want to give them any money. We don't mind if rich people get to use it. We prefer that to the government using it. Now, if the government can be serious about giving it out as cash transfers, that's a way of showing that the government is actually credible and that it can actually trust the government. So I think there is a theme running through this, from the MENA region back to Nigeria and to the Latin America region, that to get this social stability, we really have to change the behavior of government. So let me stop there before I get
Thank you so much. That's such a nice, the way you make those connections between those papers is so powerful. I hope you're gonna allow us to stand between you and tea. Take another maybe 10 minutes. I know we're running over time soon. We also started a little late. I know there's already some questions posed to the speakers, so certainly I want to go back to them. But yes, please go ahead. And maybe reintroduce yourself partly, because.
Yeah, I'm Randall Corrales, and I'm from Johannesburg Business School. my question might be naive, but I do subscribe to the notion that you can't just go on and clear out your debt without growth, but presumably we talk about sustainable growth going forward. And yesterday I heard the notion of global public goods. So the question is, if we're talking about who's going to fund this sustainable growth going forward, because as we see, most countries are so debt-ridden that they can't contribute. So the question is it going to be added to the debt of the existing debt-ridden countries, or is there going to be some benefactor jumping up and say we'll fund it, or where is it going to come from? Because this is I'm really grappling with this issue to understand it. And I really appreciate your remarks, because in South Africa we see a collapsing infrastructure and people want to build new bridges instead of maintaining the existing ones. So that's a tough messaging that I think we need to get across to politicians. But that was just another side. And also going back to basics about education and investment. In the basic things that make a country grow, it seems to have gotten out by the back door. Let me stop there.
Great question. And of course, we all look at the South African examples, like somehow the money there may be available in other countries, even less so, right? So thank you for, yeah, I'm sure. Other questions? Or shall we quickly go back to maybe in the same order of the speakers? Maybe like take 1 minute what you've taken away. If there's specific questions, maybe you want to discuss this bilaterally. But the last word to each of the speakers. Then I go in the same order. Start with Mma, Ramiro, Luis, and Ibrahim, and then Shanta. You want to come back again?
Thank you so much for the insightful contributions. I mean, I'm really excited that both of you are here and, you're giving this experts review. It's really great. So first off, to respond to the comments on debt restructuring versus debt swap, right? So the way the paper defines debt swap is that debt service payments are reduced, and in exchange, investments are made into climate projects agreed upon by both creditor and debtor governments. I'm not sure how the presentation came across, but that's how, in the paper, that's how it's defined. The comment about adaptation and how, environmental spending does not necessarily have to increase in order to meet adaptation needs is very key, because it was very puzzling, when we had the results from the 5 countries. Why on earth would environmental spending reduce by up to 40% after a debt for climate swap? So that was very important. The comments on the MDRI and how we haven't used the savings properly is something that rings through, to be honest, across the entire country, because we've been here before, and creditors obviously do not have amnesia. So the policymakers that are prone to debt restructuring or debt swaps, they've encountered this difficulty that you've highlighted with creditors. So what's the guarantee that you won't come back in another 15 years to request for the same thing? The only contribution I'll make to that is in the periods following the MDRI, so from 2005 to say 2009, 2010, there were actually improvements in HDI indicators. But more recently, with a certain administration coming into power, we've seen a reversal. So hopefully, the administration is leaving soon. So hopefully, we're optimistic that this debt swap can actually work, and it can actually get us back on track and increase spending in these areas. These are my comments, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramiro.
Yes, let me just react to Professor Devarajan comments. The final comment on the role of the government. I think that we are here doing research about really a complex future and a complex set of instruments that we need to deploy and so on. And sometimes we forget that we are dealing with not so capable and credible governments. So in a way, I mean, implementation matters a lot. So if we can design, best scenarios and discuss about that, but I think that here we have a huge obstacle, and is that in many of our countries, citizens don't trust governments. So it's really hard to think about first steps in doing all this if we don't have a new social contract, around these issues. And I think that in many of our countries, we need to start from scratch, regarding this. So that's my final reaction to Professor Devarajan's insightful comment, the final comment.
Thanks. Luis?
Yeah, just a few comments. I think the just transition in climate change means that you cannot just do the mitigation and that's it, no? Because then you will have a lot of stranded assets and unemployed people and a lot of other problems. So need to be attached as well with the social program, no? And basically, but when you begin to add that to the infrastructure cost and everything, at least in Latin America, this begins to be in the range of 15% of the GDP. No? So to make this just social, economic, and political transition, you really need a lot of money. No? So we are not in a situation to do it, and we need to think in general the whole idea of just transition, thinking of how we make more robust our fiscal situation, our debt situation, and the change of structural development. In that sense, I think, as they were mentioning, the public goods are a fundamental thing, and climate is a global public good that we need to support. Probably this carbon tax, if they come, they probably will be attached to some sort of basic universal income that it will help with the political reluctance to move in that direction. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luis. Ibrahim?
Yes, well, basically, I agree with Shanta's comments, and just wanted to add one little thing related to climate adaptation. I think some of the countries, Mediterranean countries, such as Egypt and Tunisia in particular, but maybe also like Morocco, they face also the challenge of the sea level rise. And so this actually entails much more than improving the infrastructure, which is, of course, very important. I think maybe relocating future development into, from the coastal lines to the hinterland, to the interior, might be, an issue that needs to be considered seriously as a response, as an adaptation response to sea level rise.
Last word for you, Shanta. Thanks.
No, not the last word, but I wanted to answer the question about global public goods. Just because we use the term global public goods, it doesn't mean that somebody has to sort of dip into their pocket and actually pay for it. One of the most effective ways of achieving the global public good of climate mitigation is a carbon tax, a global carbon tax. That doesn't necessarily require more expenditures. It's a shift in expenditures from people spending on fossil fuels to spending on renewables and non-carbon intensive activities. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we'll all have to dip into our pockets and pay for that global public good. It actually means a shift in policies that could lead to a low carbon or zero carbon environment. Just let me add one other thing, which is, I think we economists are guilty of this. We keep talking about climate mitigation as a global public good, which it is. But if you look at one particular, the biggest contributor to carbon dioxide is coal. Now it turns out that coal also has local externalities because coal pollutes. It creates breathing problems for people who live in near coal-fired plants. And there's a very interesting paper by the IMF that calculates the externality, the social cost of the pollution, and compares it to the social cost of carbon emissions. And it turns out the local externality is bigger, and in some cases twice as big as the global externality. So you can tell countries like China and India, forget about global public goods and all the fact that you have to pay for somebody else's benefits and all of that stuff. Worry about your own people. You're killing your own people by burning coal in your own neighborhood. Just save poor Indians from dying of coal dust, and poor Chinese as well. And we will have achieved zero carbon without ever mentioning global public goods. No, but that they should fund because it's their own people. China is responsible for the health of the Chinese people. Why should they go around killing Chinese people? Right? So that's their responsibility. And India should cover the costs of shifting out of coal, because coal is killing Indian people. Actually, it's worse because the coal is on the east side of India and the wind blows east to west, so it's killing the western. Well, anyway, let's not get into that.
Thanks so much, Shanta, and thanks for bringing those together. There's to come back to the funding. As I think I publicly declared, I'm not optimistic that global funding is available. I mean, I live in countries where we don't see more funding. We see an increasing number of donors. Total funding is not available. The private sector, the decline in private sector funding. There's a Canadian Convergence put out a report that shows with that private funding now also is not increasing in the places where it knows. So there's not a lot that makes me optimistic. I think a very important point though is kind of a general recognition that even where the funding was available in the previous rounds of debt relief, that we've learned the lessons from what worked and what didn't work, and that I think there was a lot of a lot of good things that happened, but in the end the realization is just like if it's not nationally owned, whatever international intervention is not going to be enough, and I think this at least the emphasis on yes, debt is there. Let's not forget that Nigeria is now paying more on its debt that's investing in education. That is a scandal. That seems to be a scandal to me. We need to keep to keep in mind. But the realization that programs out of that need to be comprehensive and need to be nationally owned. I really appreciate. I think everybody comes to that. Like, yeah, the social protection spending alongside the climate investment that are needed. It's really important to build those social contracts. I think Mma hasn't focused on that, but I see her nodding. I'm sure in Nigeria it's important as anywhere else. Sri Lanka, of course, is a case. So I do hope that this research will contribute. This is not an easy thing by any means, but that this research at least contributes to supporting those debates. So I want to thank all the people that presented, the people that didn't travel. I know that's equally hard to be sitting there doing this remotely. The people who did travel, and I do want to say thank you so much to GD and all the technical people that made this possible. I know this was very hard to do. I think it worked beautifully, and I think you deserve a round of applause. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
And so ERF has another session tomorrow morning. You didn't do the advert, so I'll give it to you.
The ad for tomorrow's session? Yeah, we want to see you all tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning for another exciting session on the MENA region. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.